Righty. Well, thank you all for joining us for the fourth panel of our afternoon of the Undergraduate Mitchell Center Conference. We have two wonderful presentations from history, and we have as our commentator first, I'll introduce Kyle Burke, the Assistant Professor of History and Co-Coordinator of Peace and Conflict Studies at Hartwick College. Kyle got his PhD from Northwestern University, where I met him, and is a distinguished scholar of 20th century US history and the world. His first book, Revolutionaries of the Right, Anti-Communist Internationalism and Paramilitary Warfare in the Cold War, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2018. His next book, White Power Worldwide, is sadly relevant today, and we'll get him a lot of great comments on Twitter, I'm sure, when it comes out. We all look forward to those comments as well. He's published widely, both for academics and for the general audiences on these topics, and really excited to have him here. Our two panels this afternoon, Carson Eckhard is presenting on Ragged Battalions, Plotting Liberty, Convict Leasing and the Construction of Carceral Capitalism in Florida, 1875 to 1925. And Annalisa Lowenstein, The Politics of Pride, Conservative Visions of American Nationalism in the Vietnam War Era. And so as with all of our panels, each panelist will present for about 15 minutes, and I will give you a quick heads up as you approach that 15-minute endpoint via chat, but please do try to keep within that time. Then Kyle will have about 15 minutes to respond, and then we'll open it up to broader conversation. Carson, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Can you all see my screen? Okay, perfect. So the title of my thesis project is Ragged Battalions, Plotting Liberty, Convict Leasing, Resistance, and the Construction of Carceral Capitalism in Florida from 1870 to 1925. I'm especially grateful to my advisor, Mia Bay, for all of her assistance throughout this year-long process. So to give a brief overview on what convict leasing was, the convict leasing system rose to prominence across the US South in the wake of the Civil War. And it was a system in which convicts, who were often Black men and women convicted of contrived or petty crimes, were leased to private developers who used them as a large unfree labor force. And unlike other states who primarily utilized the convict leasing system as a means of sort of reinvigorating the agricultural economy of the slavery era, Florida employed convict leasing to a distinctly different means, or a distinctly different purpose, which was really to economically develop the state. Prior to the onset of the Civil War, Florida was largely swampland, and convict leasing was applied very deliberately in Florida in order to create new industries that did not exist prior to the Civil War. My project examines how convict laborers became a considerable force of urban development and industry in Florida, and also explores the ways in which convict leasing created a model for privatized penal labor that in some form still exists today in the US. Importantly, Florida's reliance on the lease system for the construction of industry throughout the state sets it apart and accounts for the relative magnitude and harshness of Florida's leasing system. So to start by briefly discussing what Florida looked like prior to the Civil War, because that's a big part of why convict leasing became so important to Florida's economy. This is a map of Florida prior to the Civil War, and on the right is a map of Florida's counties with notes on the number of enslaved people and the percentage of the population that was enslaved prior to the Civil War. So you can see that really the only counties that were even established are almost entirely in sort of the northern half of Florida, and the highest percentages of enslaved people were located mostly in the Panhandle, in Duval County, where Jacksonville is, and also in Hillsborough County. In my analysis of convict leasing, I found that the counties with the highest arrest rates were almost exactly the same counties that had the highest rates of enslaved people during the slavery era. And to begin, I want to give some context about Florida's first prison, because unlike other states in the South, Florida did not turn immediately to convict leasing. Instead, in 1865, Florida felt the need to establish a formal prison at Chattahoochee, which is near Tallahassee. The prison was housed in a former Confederate military arsenal, which it still to today actually now operates as a mental hospital. The warden of Florida's first prison later became the Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives. His name was Malachi Martin, and he's here on the left. Martin was originally from New York, and seeing opportunity to acquire political power moved to Florida at the end of the Civil War, where he was almost immediately placed in charge of Florida's newly established prison. Martin, from the outset, used the prisoners who he was placed in charge of for his own personal gain, requiring them to build him a mansion and to work his vineyard, even though the state ordered that they only be employed for the, quote, betterment of Florida. Over the next 10 years, word of Martin's abuses kind of continually spread, and the state soon became sort of fed up with Martin's treatment of the prisoners, and so turned, somewhat ironically, to convicts leasing to ensure that at least if prisoners were enduring these abuses, it would be distinctly towards what they believed would be Florida's gain as a whole by employing them at industry instead of Martin's sort of private enriching schemes. But I want to begin by talking about the first incarcerated person in Florida's recorded history, at least, who was a child named Cyrus Williams. We don't know how old he was when he was arrested, although it's likely he was between about the ages of 8 and 12. He was arrested for trying allegedly to steal a horse that he was too small to mount and ride, and was sentenced to 20 years hard labor on Martin's sort of penal plantation. And Williams was too small to engage in this hard penal labor that Martin required of his prisoners. So he wasn't really sure what to do with the young boy. So he created a plan that he thought would potentially, quote, morally correct Cy Williams' apparent deviancies. And so he gave the boy 4 bricks and ordered him to walk back and forth across the prison yard, stacking 2 at one end and then taking the other 2 to the other end. And J.C. Powell, who wrote the monograph, American Siberia, noted that Williams, quote, grew up at the task and over the course of about 10 years wore out 4 sets of bricks until he was strong enough to do the hard manual labor that Williams or Malachi Martin required of his prisoners. And I think that this is a really pertinent example in thinking about how Florida's carceral system really from its onset was predicated on often arbitrary and senseless violence and white supremacist control. By 1875, the state removed all incarcerated people from Martin's care, instead leasing them to railroad developers initially, and in the meantime began to lay the legislative groundwork for what would become Florida's convict leasing system. So Florida's convict leasing system was different from other states in the South because it was entirely privatized. In 1910, Amos W. Butler, who was then the president of the American Prison Association, proclaimed at the organization's national convention that the, quote, lease system was exclusively in use in Florida, end quote. While by the measure of most modern historians, the convict lease system was in use in other states, perhaps most notably in Alabama, Butler's statement illustrates the various ways in which states constructed their lease systems. Several other states relied on a partial lease agreement in which the state remained responsible for providing inmates with shelter and care while leasing their labor to private companies. This was known as the contract system. Because Alabama, like North Carolina and Georgia, controlled medical care within its convict camps and theoretically held a considerable degree of oversight, Butler and his contemporaries labeled the leasing practices of these states as an example of the contract system, distinguishing it from the fully privatized stockades in Florida. Florida, unlike other states, placed all burden of care on the lessee, and this included medical care. So all inspections of camps that the state would periodically order when the state received bad press, the lessees would regularly pay off the medical inspectors because they were responsible for providing all care. While other states abolished the lease and lash one by one, convict leasing remained fully operational in Florida until 1923. And comparative studies conducted of convict leasing generally rely on other southern states. However, in 1924, one critic dismayed, in Florida, the barbarities of the system have been in some respects even worse than those in any other state, noting that Florida's total privatization of the penal system was likely a primary cause of this barbarity. For example, while other states funded and provided medical care for convicts, within the lease system in Florida, the camp physician, quote, receiving a salary from the lessee failed to report to the state prison commission the unsanitary conditions of the camps. So this photo is perhaps the most famous photo of convict leasing anywhere in the South. It's a photo of Florida convicts likely working on a turpentine plantation in Florida. in considering whether or not to use photos of incarcerated people in my thesis, I had a lot of talks with my advisor about whether or not that was ethical, given that all of these photos were almost certainly taken without people's consent. And we kind of decided together that the importance of showing these people's faces and sort of illustrating the brutality of the convict leasing system by ensuring that incarcerated people were at the center of it was important, and that showing these images was an important way to do that. So these incarcerated people were serving time in prison in Florida after the leasing system was very solidly underway. And at that point, the state had developed a business of incarceration in Florida. This image is an image of a bid. The state required that they advertised really, really widely, in fact, around the world, as far away as Berlin, for industrialists to place bids on the lease of all state convicts. And at that point, a complicated system of subleasing ensued, in which convicts would sometimes pass through the hands of up to, in some cases, as many as 7 subleases before arriving at a point where they would be required to work. So the state only had 3 requirements for those who were planning to lease or sublease convicts. So to submit the bid for all leases, applicants had to submit a $12,000 deposit upon submission of their bid and follow limited protocols for the subleasing of incarcerated people to other parties. And the state demanded the work of prisoners benefit the state, requiring that prisoners remain in state and that their labor contribute to, quote, the development of the resources of the state of Florida. However, there was almost no oversight, and the state did not track prisoners as they progressed through this subleasing system, which further disincentivized convict operators, as they were called, from taking any proper care of their prisoners. A North Carolina railroad operator perhaps said it best when he said, "These convicts, we don't own them, we don't lives." Here is a piece of stationery that E.B. Bailey, who obtained the lease of all convicts in Florida and then later subleased many of them, had made to show sort of to other people his prowess as a businessman. You can see on the left that there are incarcerated people working in a phosphate mine, although at first glance it looks very similar to similar stationery made during the slavery era that showed enslaved people picking cotton. Bailey is a really interesting case study because he was born on a plantation to a wealthy slave-owning father. He later attended the University of Georgia before coming back to Florida, where he became a merchant, and later, like many people who were operating convicts, became heavily involved in Florida's government. At one point, there was actually a scandal in which it appears he may have bribed the state in order to obtain this lease of convicts. Bailey provides a really interesting case study for examining just how much sway convict operators often had over the state legislature. And this really slowed Florida's path to reform. While other states began to pass, if limited, reforms to their carceral systems, Florida routinely vetoed such measures and even sometimes expanded their laws in order to further incentivize businessmen to profit from convict leasing. And one such example is in 1906, the Florida-Georgia Sawmill Association passed a resolution demanding that Florida's legislature make the state's vagrancy laws more, quote, effective as a means of procuring more convict labor, which was a staggering request given that Florida's vagrancy statutes were known to be the most pervasive in the South. And despite its already strict vagrancy statutes, the legislature quickly acquiesced to this request, expanding the state statute to include, quote, all but the state's most staid bourgeois inhabitants. Pressure from the private sector resulted in the criminalization of rogues and vagabonds, common pipers and fiddlers, drunkards, persons who neglect their calling or employment and misspend what they earn, idle persons, and all able-bodied male persons over 18 years of age who are without means of support, among others. And so the state's very quick and kind of flagrant willingness to allow private interests to sort of sway penal policies shows just how much private and industrialist interests really shaped Florida's prison policies during that time. And lastly, I want to turn briefly to the conditions in Florida's convict camps. A key argument that I make in my thesis is that these private interests allowed for just increasing barbarity Florida's convict camps. And the strongest primary source on this is a book that was written in 1891 by a man named J.C. Powell, who was a captain, or now we would say warden, of a Florida convict camp for 14 years. And on the left and right are etchings from his book. On the right, there's a hunting hound. The state eventually required all convict operators to have at least 2 hounds on site in order to hunt down those who tried to escape. And then on the left is an illustration of an anecdote from Powell's book, in which upon finding an inmate who had a lover, Powell was really proud to boast of how he made each of them with one another until they were both really horribly beaten. And Powell in his book describes the conditions of Florida convict camps, showing just how much leeway the state gave convict operators in creating conditions that were really as primitive and as abusive as really possible. Powell writes, covering a space 125 feet in length and 60 feet by width is the stockade, or the cell as it is improperly styled. It has no floor other than the ground. It emitted a disagreeable odor. The space that each man can occupy on this platform depends entirely on the number of prisoners confined, there being no definite allotment of sleeping space. So as these convict camps became increasingly overcrowded, the conditions only became worse, and the state did not provide any mandates for incarcerated people to have any space allotments, even any food requirements. The state really did not provide any legal guidance on any of these measures, and failed to provide any oversight to ensure that incarcerated people were being. As a result, corruption became very, very widespread throughout the state, and even sort of regular everyday Floridians noted just how much the state was really manufacturing convicts. An op-ed written in 1906 noted, "We have made too many convicts for the demand and must cease manufacturing the demand until the demand and supply are equal. Had the demand continued, we would exhaust supply of material and then should import more men and women into to supply our home market. Sir, you will think I'm making a mistake and mean some manufactured articles such as chairs, shoes, or hats, but do not. I mean state convicts, men and women sold to a public trust." There's a very clear market for incarcerated people that developed during the early 20th century in order to feed these industries. On the top right, you can see is a phosphate mine, which became one of the largest carceral industries in Florida. And on the left is a turpentine camp, which was the second largest industry in Florida in which incarcerated people were forced to work. And these were new industries that did not exist prior to the onset of convict leasing, and likely wouldn't have been possible without convict leasing because the work was so brutal. Free men tended to either try to move to the north or work in agricultural labor in order to escape working in either turpentine plantations or on phosphate mines because the work was so dangerous. And then finally, very briefly, this winter, with support from the Andrew Mitchell Center, I was able to create sort of a map of where these sites are today. There hadn't been any, I couldn't find any resources online on what had happened to all of these places. So I drove through a lot of northern Florida and sort of tracked down a lot of where these locations are. And you can see that phosphate mines are now campgrounds. This is an abandoned house that's kind of in the woods in the middle near Dunellen, Florida. A lot of them are now things like trailer parks, sometimes really fancy subdivisions, Walmarts, nursing homes. And so that was one thing that as I was finishing this project really stuck out to me. I'm from Florida, and to see all of these places that were very much purposefully erased was very meaningful to me, and to see what they are now. So this is a former phosphate pit that's now kind of somebody's backyard. And then of course, a railroad that was used to transport lumber is now just part of Florida's rail line. So the sort of legacy of convict leasing in Florida is somewhat hidden, but is really responsible for much of the state's development into what it is today. Connected cities and towns, and places with thriving industry, and certainly tourism. Much of that wouldn't have been possible without the labor of incarcerated Floridians on railroad lines and turpentine camps and at phosphate mines. Thank you.
Thank you, Carson. That's terrific. And if you wouldn't mind, if everyone can make sure that they're muted in the background so that we can give our presenters our full attention. Thank you so much. But now we're going to move on to Annalisa, who's going to present to us on right-wing politics in the Vietnam era in the 20th century. And then we'll go to Kyle Burke to give his comments, and then we'll open up a chance for Annalisa and Carson to respond, and then have question and answer. So Annalisa, take it away.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I also wanted to begin by thanking Carson. It's been really great to work alongside Carson, both through the Andrea Mitchell Center and through the History Honors Program, and I've really loved seeing the progress of her amazing project. So thank you so much for that presentation, and thanks to everyone for being here today. My project is called The Politics of Pride, Conservative Visions of American Nationalism in the Vietnam War Era. I thought it might be interesting to begin by explaining why I'm interested in this subject matter in the first place. There were two interests of mine that I decided to pursue in creating this project. The first one is the Vietnam War, specifically the anti-Vietnam War protests and the backlash to this war on the home front. I think that Vietnam is a really stunning example of military miscalculation and government mismanagement, and I wanted to examine what the psychological and emotional impacts of that war were on the home front. The second interest that led me to this project was nationalism. I wanted to examine the political implications of nationalism, and I think that people my age specifically, but in general, Democrats and left-leaning people today are very reluctant to call themselves patriots, to call themselves nationalists. And I wanted to interrogate this a little bit because I don't think that this was always the case. I think that in the 50s and 60s, especially in the post-war boom and in the JFK years, the left did have a claim to nationalism and was very supportive of serving your country and being proud of being an American. And I think that during the social movements of the 60s and 70s, this altered. So I wanted to delve into this in order to examine how the Vietnam War, specifically the anti-Vietnam War protests, shaped the direction of nationalism in the political sense. My findings were that the Vietnam War was indeed a polarizing event that catalyzed the political dichotomy of nationalism. And the way I structured my paper to analyze this topic is really just a cluster of actor analyses. I chose different groups of people that identified as part of the right side of the political spectrum and looked at how they interacted with the Vietnam War, how they interacted with nationalism, and interestingly, how all of these very, very different groups of people coalesced to call themselves a part of the right wing. I was fascinated by how the economic interests of all of the actors I examined in my thesis were so very different, and also how their visions for America, their visions for the future, and their pursuit of American greatness really challenged one another, yet still they were able to all support the same general political sense, the same leaders in some cases, and the same ideas that America should swing to the right. So I'm going to go briefly into discussion about my three chapters. I have the titles here. Chapter 1, The Silent Majority Speaks Up. Chapter 2, Conservative Intellectuals Join the Debate. And Chapter 3, Vietnam and the Far Right. And in each of these chapters, I look at the political journey of a different group of people through the lens of Vietnam War and the general social movements of the 60s and 70s. So to begin, in my first chapter, I look at the white working class, and I chose specific events and groups of people that I think really exemplify how certain core parts of the Democratic left and the New Deal Democratic coalition swung rightward in the Vietnam War era. So one of the key events that I looked at was the Hard Hat Riot, pictured here on the left, when in New York City, laborers, construction workers, and other union workers of different sorts came together to actually fight back against the peace movement and the students and scholars who were protesting the Vietnam War. These were people who sought to proclaim their allegiance to the government. They subscribed to the belief that people should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, that the government should not have affirmative action for Black Americans or for anyone, and people needed to work for their own prominence. And alongside this group, I looked at Eastern European American white ethnics. Ethnics is a term that I borrowed from Michael Novak, who wrote a book called The Unmeltable Ethnics. He talks about white Poles, Italians, Greeks, and Slavs, and other Eastern Europeans who were first and second generation Americans and fervently believed that you had to work for upward mobility, that government handouts were not the right way. And what I found really interesting about these two groups is that they shared a lot of commonality in that when the left was experiencing fracture in the 60s and 70s over social movements and directions for the economic future of the United States, these groups really splintered away from the New Deal coalition and became part of the right. And of course, the white working class is not a monolith by any stretch. The people who I'm talking about in this chapter were really just a sliver off of the left and the center that Nixon was able to peel off in order to gain his majority. By no means do I mean to say that the entire white working class was part of the right, but rather that specifically Nixon and other politicians were able to cleave support from the center and the left by harnessing this nationalistic effort and by waving flags in the face of the anti-Vietnam movement. My second chapter is about public intellectuals and how various right-wing individuals sought to challenge what they saw as left-wing hegemony in scholarly circles. So I have pictured here Irving Kristol, one of the fathers of the neoconservative movement, and William Buckley, who is a public intellectual, TV star, and a champion of right-wing prowess and strength and machoism. He used to challenge people on his show Firing Line in really lively debates and sought to promote his dominance as a right-wing leader. In this chapter, what I argue is that intellectuals used the Vietnam War as an intellectual battleground to actually propel right-wing ideas forward. These people sought to instill the ideals of America as the global policeman, and they wanted to use the Vietnam War as an example of, even when things don't go right, it's our duty to support other countries, it's our duty to intervene. There's this idea of supporting democracy, supporting capitalism, and rejecting communism abroad that was really harnessed in intellectual circles and that reverberated through the debate on the Vietnam War. So I look at neoconservatism and also just general mainstream conservatism in the intellectual spheres here, noting that these actors are so different from the actors in my first chapter, and how despite their different positions in US society and their different economic interests, they were both able to coalesce behind the right-wing movement and support right-wing leaders. My third chapter is called Vietnam and the Far Right. And importantly, this chapter deals with a very, very different set of actors than the first two. These are actors who are not in the political mainstream, actors who do not have an electoral bent per se, and are rather politically motivated to swing the entire spectrum towards the right and occupy a new sense of American political rightism. So I talk in this chapter about the John Birch Society, firstly, and then the KKK, and how each of these groups harnessed the anger from the loss of Vietnam, and how many veterans who fought in Vietnam and came back home with this anger and confusion from war were convinced by leaders of the far right to then join their movements and use this violence in a really harmful way. A lot of the groups that I talk about are heavily racialized and white nationalist groups that were really using the Vietnam War as coded language to actually propel white supremacist goals forward. Specifically, the KKK had a lot of this really dangerous coded language in which what they were propelling forward was less about the Vietnam War and more about race, but using the guise of bringing the war home and military language, they were able to convince people that this was patriotism, this wasn't discrimination. And of course, a caveat is that these groups were fairly small and they were not dominant in the American public, but I do want to point out that a lot of people see these groups as having their heyday earlier on in the 20th century, and they were very much alive and well during the Vietnam era and actually created the foundation of the alt-right that still exists today. So what I tried to do in my thesis was weave together these very disparate groups of people who claim to be part of the right. I think the first chapter, the white working class, the vision for American nationalism that they occupied was their willingness to obey government, to listen to authority, to work hard both in war context and in labor context back home in order to gain white worker prosperity and pull themselves up to a better position for themselves and their families. My actors in chapter 2 were fervent supporters of capitalism, of democracy, and of the obligation of America to support these integral American values abroad. And in contrast, my actors in chapter 3 were anti-communists who wanted to protect the right to bear arms. They wanted to maintain the rigid social hierarchy that existed in the US topped by white men, and they wanted to stop the social movements of the left. What I ultimately claim in my thesis is that these very different but overlapping types of patriotisms united in a common desire to halt and reverse the social movements of the left. So despite having such different visions for the US, despite having different economic interests, these groups were all able to claim themselves as part of this right side of the political spectrum in an effort to stop what was going on the left, to stop the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the gay movement, and the anti-Vietnam movement. There was this anger to maintain a social status quo that allowed these people to all call themselves conservatives and ignore their differences. I think that part of the reason why I was so interested in this topic is because we see a lot of this populist nationalism rearing its head again today. It's interesting to think about the various groups of people who support Trump, for example, and how the economic interests differ so greatly within Trump supporters. I also think that under Trump, there was a resurgence of far-right extremists joining the political mainstream, and a lot of the actors that I examined in my 3rd chapter reminded me of this flirtation with mainstream politics despite having such radical right-wing views. I also think that this history is really important because it illuminates the utility of dog whistle appeals to racism, sexism, and lamenting the loss of American greatness. Which are ideas that, of course, ring true today in the political right, but also harken back to the era that I'm discussing, the Vietnam War era. I think it'll be really interesting to see how nationalism is levied by various political actors in the future, particularly Biden, who we have a president who wants to continue to unify the country and keeps talking about being a president for all Americans, not just some Americans. And it'll be interesting to see whether Biden seeks to use nationalism as a unifying front and end the partial monopoly that the right holds currently on nationalism, and that connects back to the 60s and 70s, as I prove in this thesis. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Thank you to you both for presenting on your work. Now I'll turn it over to Kyle, who has comments for both of you, and then you'll have an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, thanks again, Gideon, and to everyone for coming and for the invitation. I really enjoyed reading the papers. I wrote, as I tend to do, like way too many comments, and I'm going to try to keep them as short as I can. But I have a lot to say because I thought they were just terrific papers. They're written with such verve, such passion. Their use of archives is outstanding. The argumentation is outstanding. And what is more, as you both were explaining in your presentations, they both make really strong cases for their contemporary relevance today, especially in how I was thinking about what connects these two papers is their focus on racism and revanchism, operating in two different moments of American history. Revanchism and revenge against the possibility perhaps of Black political and economic liberation after the Civil War, revenge against the 13th Amendment, and then also revenge and revanchism and also racism operating in the 1960s and really in the 1970s as the conservative movement builds a set of myths about the anti-war movement and begins portraying them not simply as opponents, but as enemies. And if they're enemies that have to be dealt with, as the far right does in the 1980s, through literal acts of war. And so I think that those two focuses actually connect these papers, even though they're obviously dealing with different topics in different eras. What I want to do is kind of dive into each one individually, going in the order that you presented them, which is also chronological, and then kind of draw some things back together at the end. So for Carson Eckhard's Ragged Battalions Plotting Liberty, I think you do a terrific job of charting a few different things, right? The early origins of carceral capitalism and mass incarceration, its connections to racial inequalities and racist rule in Florida and in the South, and in its foundational role in driving industrial development in the state. And I also really welcomed your focus towards the end of the thesis on the ways in which African-American prisoners and African-American communities tried to resist this system with varying degrees of success. But throughout the process, as you know, in really forceful language, that African-Americans resisted from the moment it took shape, as you put it. And I think your thesis does a terrific job of not just kind of situating its claims within the scholarship that exists about the origin, the nature, the evolution of convict leasing in the South, but builds upon that to make some really novel claims about the exceptional nature of convict leasing in the state of Florida. And so while you show that convict leasing in Florida dealt with many of the same problems that other southern states were trying to deal with, a dearth of capital investment, a labor shortage, fears or myths about African-American criminality, and the overarching desire to fashion a new mode of white supremacy after Reconstruction, you also show how, as you put it, Florida simultaneously fit and shattered that mold. And because you have this intense focus and draw to my attention, I taught in Florida and I thought a lot about Florida convict leasing, but the extent to which the system was so deeply privatized. In Florida, as Floridian lawmakers and convict lessers and industrialists all joined us in this concerted effort to accelerate Floridian industry, railroad construction, lumber, turpentine, phosphate, and so on, they utilized a peculiar version of convict leasing that was so intensely privatized, and as a result, the most intensely exploitative and indeed deadly of all the southern states that employed this system. And you chart this story with, what I have to say, is just really stunning archival work. I was just fascinated by not just the variety of sources, but the way in which you interrogated those sources all throughout. And what you show through those is how the Florida convict leasing system unfolded with almost like no direct oversight from the state, apart from providing both the political capital to make the system happen, and then the policing powers to lock up large numbers of African-American men for minor crimes or sometimes no crime at all. And this is really distinguishing, right? I think this is the most telling part of this thesis, that elsewhere, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, state authorities had some role, a small role perhaps, but some role in running and monitoring convict leasing camps, mostly and most clearly by funding and providing for medical care for the convicts. But in Florida, the immensely profitable practice of subleasing brought convicts further and further away from the aegis of the state and further into the hands of industrial firms that, to be said, really only wanted one thing, right, which is profit. And so as this process unfolded, I kind of thought of it like a shell game, slowly moving prisoners further and further away in a deliberate attempt to cut the state out of any role in maintaining their welfare. And so even though they were required, as you note, to cover all the costs of transporting, carrying, securing the inmates, they generally just chose not to do that and cut those costs entirely. And so instead, the daily regimen for prisoners within the convict leasing camps was disease and corporal punishment and a strong possibility of death. And indeed, those prisoners, as you know, died in appallingly high numbers as state investigators and journalists throughout this period, especially after 1910, continue to note time and again that Florida system is so violent. And I think another really telling thing, in many ways, the most kind of shocking and fascinating thing about the story you tell is how central corruption was to it. Right, that it's not as if this kind of industry emerged on its own and then the state granted the ability for the industry to function or created a legal regime in which it could, but rather the very same political actors that were guiding the state's industry and its development were the exact same people often that were in control of the convict leasing system and its profits, right? And so you show that so well with the case of E.B. Bailey, who for a time is essentially the only convict lessor in the state of Florida, and he gains that role, that he wins that contract immediately after he enters the Florida state legislature. You show these other kinds of patterns of corruption, as well as police forces and judges were also roped into the action too, because industrial firms and convict listers offered so many kickbacks and incentives for them to basically manufacture, as you put it, the prison labor force. And so I think you do a terrific job of capturing all those elements. But as I noted before, I think one of the most striking things at the end of the thesis is how you read against the grain of Florida's penal archives to show how resistance was emerging with them too. So you can see that kind of forms of everyday resistance, shirking work, running away, feigning illness, and also forging communities within the camps. And you also chart the different kinds of legal resistance that families and reformers were attempting to make outside the system, which served to kind of chip away at perhaps some of its worst edges, but by and large did not end the system itself. And I think it's really telling that the system only collapses after it, as you begin, it's a white inmate from North Dakota who dies in the camp, and that it's this particular instance that it was a white man that died in the camps. That is what compels inquiry, and that's what compels change. And so I have to say, I think this is scholarship of the highest order. I really do. I think it was absolutely outstanding. One of the things that came to mind, and you were sketching towards this as well in your presentation, and perhaps I can get you to talk on it a little bit more, is what kind of continuities, or perhaps more importantly, what kind of changes you see in this particular version of carceral capitalism as it was coming into being in the late 19th century, and what we see in the late 20th and early 21st century with the rise of a different kind of privatized prison industry that operates in a different way, that has a different relationship to the state, that has a different relationship to free labor and organized labor, and also has a different mode of profit. And so I wonder what echoes you see of convict leasing in that, but also how you'd reckon the differences between these two systems. They share a lot, and obviously the intense racial inequalities that guide punitive policing and mass incarceration figure into this just as they did in convict leasing. But there's also substantial differences, and I was hoping to perhaps invite you to maybe reflect on those a bit. So yeah, it's a great job, terrific thesis. And the same goes for Annalisa Lowenstein's thesis, The Politics of Pride, which is really in like kind of my wheelhouse in terms of my own interests. I share the very same ones: the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and conservative politics in the U.S. and in the wider world. And you do something that's really important here that many historians haven't done. I count myself as one that's begun to try to think about how U.S. foreign relations shape the rise of the right at home. But by and large, the field, as you note, doesn't do that. There's only a few works in that vein. And so what you're doing here is of crucial importance, which is to begin erasing that artificial boundary that historians often have between the domestic strands of American history and the foreign strands of American history, and to slide them together. And by focusing on the war, but in particular how conservatives framed the anti-war movement, we can begin to do that, because it shows so much about how conservatives think about their own state, how they define and really try to colonize the notion of patriotism, and how they increasingly begin to identify other Americans, not just as opponents, like I said before, but as enemies, wartime enemies, perhaps. And you chart the story really interestingly by focusing on these really three distinct groups of right-leaning Americans, right? The white working class that is beginning to slide out of the New Deal coalition, elite conservative leaders like William F. Buckley or Norman Porter's, and then the white supremacist militias and paramilitaries of the 1970s, 1980s, and the 1990s. And what you show is that despite these very distinct origins, distinct class outlooks, distinct visions of the nation and who should count within it, they nevertheless all are able to align themselves and gain a kind of common discourse and reclaim a racialized vision of the United States in their telling of a certain set of stories about the Vietnam War and about the anti-war movement. And so they align in this notion that the anti-war movement is essentially un-American, is essentially unpatriotic, and is essentially subversive. And as they make that argument, they're also drawing together, to an extent I think you could perhaps deal a little bit more in your comments, with a set of other enemies that are also emerging in their minds too. Civil rights and Black Power movements, women's rights and gay rights activists. These are all operating their heads too as different versions of subversives that are pulling away at the foundations of American national identity in its racialized dimensions. And so the war provides a way for both these groups to bond, then also to begin to find a common cause to deal with this other set of enemies that's also emerging, and really to deal with the social and political changes created by the capital S 60s moment. In your focus on working class communities, I think you do a terrific job to point to the ways in which the war produced a lot of resentment, a groundswell of resentment within working class white communities, but a sense of resentment that operated, as you know, in a really kind of complex way. Because on the one hand, many working class whites, as you note, found themselves opposing the war, especially as it became clear that U.S. forces were not gaining ground against the communist and nationalist forces in Vietnam, and also the sense of class resentment that emerged because 80% of the soldiers that fought in the Vietnam War, as you know, were poor and working class, right? So this disparate sense of duty and service generates a set of grievances. And yet at the same time, they feel exploited and frustrated, exploited by politicians, frustrated by the war's failures, the apparently meaningless sacrifice of their lives in the battlefield, but they also find themselves rejecting the anti-war movement as they can view it as both unpatriotic and as a product of elite class privilege, because the draft operates in a particular way to shield college students. Wealthier Americans as well had a numerous set of resources that could help them avoid military service or at the very least combat duty. And so the white working class finds itself in some ways rejecting the war, but also rejecting the anti-war movement. And this stems from this really deeply rooted sense of patriotism and duty, right? And so many even acknowledge that the Vietnam War, it might not even be a just war, but it's an American war, nevertheless. And they are, after all, Americans, right? And so that's what you do, is you support the nation, even perhaps as it makes massive blunders or engages in immoral or amoral actions, right? And this becomes a version of their patriotism, that to critique that project and to challenge it is itself unpatriotic. And I think it's really important to note, and you do this some in the thesis, but I'd like to expand on it more here, is that this vision of the anti-war movement that was being pressed and kind of embraced by working class whites stemmed in such a large part from how conservative political figures and conservative leaders like Buckley and others were framing the anti-war movement. But I think it's also important to note that this vision of the movement as being solely composed of young, radical, countercultural elements who despise the nation and its values is broad, and it's also intensely faulty. And while some elements of the anti-war movement did indeed fit that mold, the Weatherman organization is perhaps like the clearest example of that, right? Leftist radicals attempting, or at least considering, waging war on the state itself. The anti-war movement of the Vietnam era was the largest and broadest in U.S. history, and it included many who identified themselves as firm American patriots and made the argument that American patriotism itself required, powerful and profound opposition to unjust and immoral acts propagated by the nation's political and military leaders. And so it's conservative leaders themselves that begin creating this myth, and then it helps working class whites latch onto it and then reframe their own set of grievances about the war. And to that end, Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew, right, they do as much as anyone to paint the anti-war movement, not just as unpatriotic, but as Nixon, intones in his speeches, like in 1969, the silent majority speech, the primary reason for American failure and humiliation in Vietnam is the anti-war movement in their eyes. And so, I think it's really important to acknowledge that this framing of the anti-war movement that is emerging here is it's a caricature, right? It's not a reality of the movement itself. And so too is that kind of popular memory of the anti-war movement as protesters spitting on veterans and attacking them as baby killers. Historian Jeremy Lembeck has done a terrific work busting that myth and showing that, the notion of spitting protesters, it has essentially no basis in historical reality, and yet it figures so heavily into Americans' historical memory of the Vietnam War and of returning veterans' experiences. And on that subject of that particular narrative through which elite conservative figures who share very little in terms of their economic interests with working class whites, they drew together in this sense of opposition and deep hostility to the anti-war movement into the capital S-60s. I wonder, perhaps, if you've seen the 1970 film Joe, which suggests a way in which this was actually resonating in popular culture. Joe tells the story of a factory worker and a Wall Street executive who go on a cathartic killing spree against hippies, and it culminates in one of them, the businessman, shooting his daughter in the back as they flee from a house in upstate New York. And the film itself is trying to critique that, but it's also suggesting the real nature of this kind of alliance between two very different sets of class politics, but sharing in their opposition to the anti-war movement. And that sense of revanchism, of revenge, of violence that's offered in Joe, somewhat satirically, but also perhaps not that satirically, finds real voice in your third chapter in the right-wing groups, in the paramilitaries and the vigilantes of the 1980s and of the post-Vietnam War era. For these men, and particularly for Vietnam veterans, white veterans who joined white supremacist organizations, the Vietnam War story resonated and helped ensure that their main enemies would become domestic enemies: African Americans, liberals, Jews, leftists, peaceniks, but also the state itself. because in all of those senses, they felt betrayed by a large set of the US population and by the government itself. And so as they came home, as you know, right, they sought literal war against the state and against a cast of domestic enemies. And they did so in the purposes of trying to reclaim a vision of the nation which was rooted in whiteness, which depended on masculine and military or martial action. And this, as you know, produced an escalating set of violence, but also allowed and kind of produced a set of claims that were operating on the fringes of conservative politics that then filter back into the mainstream. And they allow and help shift the political spectrum to the right. And so these narratives, even though there's disparate groups operating here, and I think the first two chapters show kind of a coalescence, whereas the third chapter is a much more distinct group of people who oppose the anti-war movement, but offer a very different kind of strategy about how to deal with them. Nevertheless, you capture the power of how the legacy of the war and historical memories of it, of the anti-war movement in particular, structured the rise of the right in the United States. And as I noted, you do a great job in that, in extending beyond existing scholarship to deal with these issues of foreign relations. So suffice to say, I think these are excellent papers. And I suppose I'll leave it at that, but I think, right, to return to my original point, I think both help us think about how revanchism operates in American history, where moments of liberation or potential liberation or moments of change or possibly even radical change are met with swift actions and reactions that create in the minds of many, those who are trying to uphold a particular vision of a white supremacist order, the notion that other Americans, African Americans, or the members of the anti-war movement are essentially enemies, and therefore as such lose rights as citizens and fall beyond the pale of the nation. And as we confront that discourse, I think growing more popular in our own time today, as we've seen in the last 4 years or so, I think both projects help us reframe that issue. So again, I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to read and comment on the papers. I thought they were excellent. I'd love to hear your thoughts on those scores if we have time.
Absolutely. I think we have about 10 minutes left since we pushed the timing back. So Carson and Annalisa, do you want to jump in and give some comments and feedback?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for taking so much time to read both of our papers. I think I probably speak for Annalisa when I say that I wish you could do my history department presentation in an hour. That was better than I think I could have presented my thesis. To your question kind of about the development, like the ties between convict leasing and prisons today, and specifically maybe Florida's prisons today. I think I touched on this very briefly at the end, but didn't really sort of lay out the chronology. But one thing that I found really interesting was Florida's convict leasing, was abolished in the late 1920s, but pretty immediately shifted to a state penal farm at Rayford, which is really where the state's main prison still is now, called Stark, where the state basically still continued to allow like private companies to benefit from the labor of incarcerated people, but on state-owned land. And so it shifted to a more agricultural model, but actually in 1934, I think it was, like right after the state prison at Rayford opened, an inmate died in pretty similar circumstances to Martin Tabert's death, although the practices sort of continued. This particular inmate died in a sweatbox, but the state continued on this sort of semi-private model, really kind of through the 70s when it switched to a more chain gang road repair model. But even today, Florida operates, I think it's 32 camps around the state. Often they're more, like impermanent, where inmates will go out on like on a camp for a month or so, and they'll work sometimes still in like lumber, often on road crews and that kind of thing, before coming back or to another state facility. But Florida is also building private prisons, I think at the highest rate in the country still, and most of those are immigration detainment centers, but often at those facilities and at government-owned state facilities, incarcerated people are still working for private contractors. Anyone who's seen the documentary The 13th knows that, like, even for a period of time, Victoria's Secret bras were made by inmates in prison. So there certainly is a really large, still sort of private stake in corrections in the United States. And I think Florida's use of incarcerated people's labor in a very direct way and a very intentional way to grow industries is something that echoes of sort of still exists today. And the idea of using incarcerated people as a really large unfree labor force, I think has in some ways only grown as, you know, now the prison itself can be owned and operated by private industries. Like even on the Philadelphia skyline, the Aramark building on the Schuylkill River is, they're heavily involved in private prisons. I'm involved in some work in Philadelphia, and we routinely get mail from incarcerated Pennsylvanians that says Aramark on it because they have a monopoly on a lot of prison communication. So there's, I think convict leasing sort of started this model. It's really for the most part only in use in the United States, which I think is really interesting. The UK has like some private prison interest, but more in sort of things like providing food, not necessarily in inmate labor. So I think it's a really good question. And I think maybe thinking more about the history of private prisons and the ties to convict leasing is well worth doing, and thinking about how to dismantle them.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting as well, like, as you note, you know, the existence of an incarcerated labor force also serves to structure how free labor relations operate, right? And in the way in which it works today and in the past, right, is to depress wages for free workers, right? So even for those that aren't incarcerated, it structures the entire labor system itself. It's really fascinating.
I'll hop in. I also just want to echo Carson and thank you so much for reading our papers in so much detail, and also for your impeccable presentation. It's really interesting to hear my own ideas fed back to me and realize that they might actually make some sense, and it's nice. So thank you so much for presenting and for discussing and being here today. I wanted to pick up on something that you brought up about the racial element of all the topics I'm speaking of. I think that obviously when I was choosing the actors to look at, I knew that race was going to be central in the third chapter when I was looking at the KKK and other white supremacist movements and white nationalist movements. But what I didn't necessarily realize is how integral race was to the first two chapters as well, and to the fight of all different types of right-wing actors and people who used to consider themselves part of the Democratic coalition, who were swinging rightward, how all of those people were really fighting back against affirmative action for Black Americans, against the civil rights movement, and against the tides of change that were encompassing the 60s and 70s and maybe the early 80s as well. So the racial question of my thesis, I think, if I could rewrite it, I would weave that thread in right from the beginning, whereas I think I was kind of working backwards from my original plan to make sure that that was at the fore, because it is so important. And I hope that that came across, but I do think that it was so, it really went hand in hand with this framing of the anti-war movement was, in a large sense, for all three actors that I look at, a way to actually fight back against racial progress in a coded way, and to use the left as one big monolith to fight back against one of the aspects of the left, like the peace movement. You have to fight against all of it, including race progress, including progress for gays and lesbians and women. So I think that part of the reason why I loved this project was because it was about the anti-Vietnam movement, but also all of the social movements of that era of the 60s and 70s. It was also partially about the economic disintegration in 1973 and onwards, and how white working class wages plummeted, and the oil embargo, and so many different, like stagflation, so many elements of the 70s economically, that really came to the forefront of my thesis in a way that I didn't necessarily expect. So to tie together all of these threads, I think, was a challenge, since my groups were so different, but it was great to hear you pick up on them. And especially, I think the racial question is so important to me because of how exploited the idea of racial progress was by politicians, and how the villainization of the civil rights movement and civil rights leaders was so integral to a lot of what the right was trying to do during that time. So thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a really important part of my thesis that I'm glad that I could discuss.
Yeah, it's an excellent project.
Thank you.
And thank you all, and thank you, Carson and Annalisa and Kyle, for presenting and discussing today. And now I'll hand it back over to Jeff Green as we wrap up our conference for the day.
Yeah, I'll just say what Gideon has said, that we're grateful for you being here. Kyle, those such fantastic comments and really shaped a wonderful latter part of the discussion and in this last panel. And Carson and Annalisa, you've been fantastic all year long, no less so today. Good luck as you present again, it sounds, at the history department, but you've been such wonderful citizens of the workshop, and we wish you the best going forward. But this was, I think, a really rigorous and energized a conference today, and we went a little bit late every time, but in a good way, because I think there was just a lot to get in there. And oops, that's my sign that it is time to wrap up. So perfectly on cue, maybe we should do that. And I just want to thank Matt Roth, Matt Schaefer, and Gideon Cohen-Postar for everything they've done all year to make the workshop so successful. And thank you. We hope to be in touch with as many of you as possible. And thanks again, Kyle, for being here.
Thank you.